And welcome, everybody. You're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and we talk with authors, artists, and entertainers here on this show. And today I have a very special guest, Nicole Givens Clark. And I apologize, my tongue caught the better of me there. How you doing, Nicole?
I'm great. It's been a fantastic Sunday here in Charlotte.
That's awesome. Are you up there at Saga?
I am. I'm at Saga.
Oh, okay, so my friend Rachel Bruin is up there.
Yes, I have met her.
Yeah, she's up there, and I through it's so crazy, but I'm really excited about that. I wasn't able to attend this year, but I'm looking forward to like hearing back from everybody about it. How's it going up there so far?
It's a fantastic writers convention. I mean, the panels were they've been very diverse in terms of topics, and they cover the gamut from all the business aspects of writing to the creative things about how to pitch a serial, like a serial series, how to get your forensics right. We actually have a doctor, Dr. Kennedy is here, is actually speaking about, okay, this is what happens when you actually get a gunshot wound, right? And so all these things that writers need to know, it's just the gambit and breadth of topics. It's just been really, really fabulous.
That is so cool. And can you tell us just a little bit about yourself? Because Bobby Nash introduced us, and I'm really excited to have you on the show today. Bobby's been a guest on here a couple different times, and so I'm really excited about having you.
Thank you. I write science fiction, fantasy, weird westerns, and futuristic pulp stories. But I am also a publisher for Mocha Memoirs Press. And for the last 11 years, our mission at the press has been to amplify marginalized or underrepresented voices in the speculative fiction genres of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And so we primarily look for stories where the protagonist or author are people of color, or identify on the LGBTQ continuum, or are disabled, or all, or whatever combination of those they label themselves or identify as. And so those are the stories that don't always get told in horror or in in speculative fiction. So those are
I
the
think that's
stories we seek
great.
out.
I really do think that's great. I have a friend named Allie Hurt, Alidria Hurt,
Yes.
and she she does a lot of black spec fiction, and
Hmm.
that's something else that I really feel like is important. And I try to help her. We last year she was trying to put together like a black spec fiction thing here in
Hmm.
Savannah,
Hmm.
and so I host. I've got this thing that called the Savannah Quill, but last year I called it the Savannah Authors Expo, and so I hosted a black spec fiction. Well, it was kind of like it was going to be a black spec fiction, but it ended up being kind of like this, like you were talking about with the gamut of things,
Hmm.
and talking about underrepresentation and that kind of stuff. So it was pretty cool, and I feel like that's important, in not just in writing, but in general in the world. We need,
Right.
we need to be able to say, hey, make it open and available for everybody to do the things that they want to do, work, life, play, all those things that they want to, be able to just be a human being and live your life.
Right. And Alondria, amazingly enough, is one of the contributing authors to our Black Magic Women anthology. We published it a few years ago for Women in Horror Month.
Yeah.
And that anthology includes 18 stories, or horror stories written by Black women. And Alondria was one of those women. And so she's in that anthology as well.
Yeah.
But one of the things about having representation in fiction is it's not just great for the person of color or the person who identifies as LGBTQ to be able to say, I see myself in this book. It's also for people who are not in those underrepresented categories to be able to see heroes and protagonists that don't look like them either. And so I feel like that, oh, wait, so Superman or this hero can be a Black man or a Black woman or a person who is in a wheelchair. So it's not just great for the people who identify for in those groups, but it's also really great for the people who don't, to be able to look around and see a diverse protagonist as a in these stories
I
and be able to
agree
say,
with you. I
hey,
totally agree with
okay.
you. The only thing I don't like lately in the media and Hollywood and comics, I would rather see new original characters instead of
Hmm.
characters being rebranded.
Yes.
I feel like that's just kind of like a cheap shortcut, and it's okay to be like, oh yeah, we're gonna do something to kind of mix things up, and it's all like kind of like shock tactic type stuff, like, oh gosh, what are we gonna do next? But I would much rather see original characters that represent different people. I would much rather see that than trying to rebrand. But the problem is when you have like a new character, it doesn't matter if they're white or not white or people of color or whatever. Any new kind of character, they don't get the same kind of play as other characters.
Well, established characters, right? That
Established
have a
characters,
following or a fandom,
right?
right? Yeah.
Right. And so, that's the only gripe that I have about the way that they've tried to rebrand characters instead of saying, "Hey, here's a platform. Let's create all brand
Right.
new diverse characters."
Mhm.
I don't really like using that word diverse, but that's the best way I can describe it. But just like you said, being able to show, okay, well, his little kid, maybe they don't see themselves. And I tell you what, if you go anywhere, like any kind of bookstore or anything like that, like I was just at a major retailer, I don't want to say their name, but if you look like at children's books, for example,
Mhm.
because I've
Yep.
written some children's books, you see a sea of white.
Yep.
And I'm not trying to sound funny or racist or anything like that. I'm a white guy, and I'm not trying to sound racist against white people or anything like that, because I know there's people out there like, oh, what I'm saying is that there is not, I mean, like just physically not the representation out there showing, kids of color, kids that aren't white, that, hey, yeah, I'm part of the group too, guys. Like, hey, and the reason why that came across my mind was because last week, on Friday, I get to go to a local elementary school here. I had written a children's book a couple years back and illustrated it, but I never published it. Just one of those things I did for a school thing. And I was looking at different books. I was like, I was going to pick up a book to go take to the school to read. And I was like, man, there really are not other people represented. And I was like, wow, this is just crazy. Because it's something that you hear like on, social media a lot, and you hear it, in the news and stuff like that. But then when you look at reality and you say, okay, well, let me look at what is this thing that people are talking about.
Mhm.
And you see like, oh, wait a minute, there
Right.
really isn't
I
the
mean,
representation.
they release like We Need Diverse Books release. They actually We Need Diverse Books is an organization that is promoting diverse books for school age children. And so they have a campaign every year, but it's not just them. Like they publish a weekly releases statistics that talk about how few books are diverse, and it's really sad. When you look at it's just like maybe like 6%. It's not a lot at all when you look at the overall breadth, especially in children's books. They do it for children's books. It's like 6% of children's books are maybe 3 to 6%
And that,
are actually
that's what I
diverse.
love
That's
about
pretty
indie
horrible.
stuff. That's one of the things I love about indie stuff is that it kind of has leveled the platform for the open, like the entry point.
Hmm.
Anybody can publish, anybody can get out there and put their thing
Right.
out there now. And, then the market, kind of says, okay, well, is this good or not good? But then also, the weird thing about it, with like social media and stuff like
Hmm.
that, is like, well, how do you get it out to people? How do you tell people about it? And I do believe in the word of mouth. I really believe in the word of mouth. And
Hmm.
something that's really good will rise to the top. Something that's really like catching people's interest will come out. Um, but a lot of stuff is just like, for example, using Facebook as an example. I've got over 700 people that like my Facebook thing. If I don't pay for advertising, then two or three people might see a post.
Right.
Maybe
And that's
20 or 30 if somebody
the whole
shares it.
Facebook algorithm. Yeah.
And that's all
Well.
social media. All that's, it's like
Hmm.
all the same algorithm. It's like, okay, well, how do we get people to pay for advertising?
Hmm.
And that's cool. That's their business model. And, we use it for free. But, for me, it's kind of like, how do you, especially like, just being an indie guy. But then on top of that, if you complicate the situation with like saying, okay, well, I've got this one specific little book, like I was saying about writing the vampire books earlier.
Right.
Um, how do I reach those people? And then
Right.
like with the sleigh, I want to talk so much about the sleigh thing. When you have that, it's like, okay, well, how do I reach the people that want to support the
Right.
Indiegogo?
Right.
And you like have to dig, like you have to keep digging in those layers, and you're like, okay,
You
well,
do.
how do you get
Yeah.
to those folks, and so I think it's pretty cool. I'm so glad that you were able to come on the show today. And, I know it's kind of short notice, but
Okay.
one of the things I do on this show, Nicole, my son is an artist, a musician, and he's going to play some live music for us. So this is
Oh,
Sebastian,
yay!
Sebastian Messer, and everybody that listens to the show, you've heard Sebastian before, but he's going to be playing some acoustical guitar today. So, Bass, take it away, bud. Awesome. Thank you, Bass. Yeah, he's my son, Nicole, and he plays heavy metal, but he also plays acoustic. And was that one of your originals, Bass?
This is
Kind of noodling.
No, thank you. That was really nice.
Excuse me. My allergies have been killing me. So, um, can we talk?
It's the season.
Yeah. Can we talk about Slay?
Sure.
Okay, so Slay is Stories of the Vampire Noir, edited by you. And I'm just going to read this short summary off of the Indiegogo, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
For over 10 years, Mocha Memoirs Press's mission has been to amplify marginalized voices in speculative fiction. Our stories are bold, fearless fiction. Stories traditionally kept in the margins are unleashed in this groundbreaking anthology. Our next project, Slay, Stories of the Vampire Noir, will continue our mission by producing an anthology of stories about vampires and hunters from African diaspora. Diaspora? How do you say that?
Diaspora.
Okay. That's the first time I've seen that word. So that's cool. These well-written stories are diverse of the vampire mythos, as well as introduce these tales of horror to horror lovers, avid readers, and audiences hungry, no pun intended, for well-written and diverse stories. Your support of this campaign allows Mocha Memoirs to not only publish these stories, ensures our authors are paid at a professional rate, and offered artwork is top notch and quality of the product. And then you have it goes into like all the different levels or whatever.
The perks, yeah.
And you have so it shows Cherie Renee Thomas,
Yes.
uh,
We're very excited to have her. She's
Craig L.
amazing.
Gidney,
Yep.
Terry Clark,
Mhm.
Jessica Cage, Michelle Tracy Berger, Stephen Van Patten.
Yep. Those are our
And
anchor authors, and so we're going to have 15 stories total. But those 5 anchor they're the anchor authors for the whole anthology. So we'll be filling 10 more slots.
nice. And this is going to be for people of color, or is it going to be mostly for like African American?
So we're looking for all kinds of stories from the African diaspora. So so the African diaspora is everywhere in the world where Africans were transported during
Oh,
the
okay.
transatlantic slave trade or currently live and reside. And so they can be from as far away as Vietnam, as for the Dominican Republic, there any country in Africa, right? So we're just looking for those stories, Aboriginal stories of vampires, like whatever. Basically, the hunter or the vampire or the protagonist has to identify as being from one of those diaspora places,
Okay, so when you said Aboriginal, what do you mean with Aboriginal?
like from Australia. So the Aborigines, this is what happens when you have been up for so many hours.
I know the feeling.
Some of the identify as black, in terms of like being like othered in Australian culture. So they may apply also in some stories of their version or idea of a vampire and how that would work. So we're looking for own stories, but we're going to mix those in with other stories as well.
Hmm.
So I'm looking for a wide breadth of stories. I'm not looking for it to be predominantly African American
I gotcha.
vampire stories. I'm
That's
looking
cool.
for a wide breadth of stories and differently abled vampires or hunters, anyone who identifies on the LGBTQ spectrum. Like, I'm just looking for, I want stories. I want this collection to be incredibly full of different vampire stories, if
Yeah,
that makes sense. So
yeah.
yeah, yep.
It's crazy because I was talking to my friend. And I was like, I was thinking of Blade and Blackula. Those were like
Mhm.
two of my
Yep.
favorites when I was a kid. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be so cool because typically you get the vampires that are like, oh well, European, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so and I totally get that with Dracula being a mainstay for vampire history or whatever
Mhm.
of lore, and also European lore, but there's all like you said, there's a lot of around the world
Yes.
that there
Different.
are
Yep.
these other
Mhm.
stories that are
Yep.
similar, and I think that's really cool.
Yes. I cannot wait. So I have been getting submissions. I just haven't read any of them yet because I'm waiting to the deadline. Um, before I sit down and like actually go through and start selecting to fill those 10 spots.
Yeah.
And if we fund and reach our, if we fund, then we have stretch goals to add additional stories. And so it's really important. So if you're going to fund, please
Well,
fund
we can't
Indiegogo.
do
But
any kind of selling.
right, oh sorry,
Yeah, that's
but yeah,
okay. Well, we
if
can
you're
talk.
interested in
Like
the
you have this
project,
Indiegogo, and people can check it
yes,
out on all that. Um, the reason why we can't do that is because we're a non-commercial
that's
community radio
correct.
station.
Yes, my
So
apologies.
no, 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 no. I just have to let you know. Um, we're gonna do a station ID real quick. Everybody, you're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul, and I'm your host Adam Messer. This is the Adam Messer Show. My special guest today is Nicole Givens Kurtz. And Nicole is an author. I saw, just kind of checked you out a little bit. Are you also a teacher?
I used to teach. I taught for 18 years.
Okay, great. That's so awesome. We love our teachers. Yeah,
Yep.
I totally love that. I think it's I'm so glad that you're out here doing this because I really feel like it's important. A topic I would like to ask you about
Mhm.
is with writing.
Mhm.
Okay, so and that's just gonna sound funny, but with writing, like there's a big kind of issue right now where guys that write women,
Mhm.
they are missing the mark, right? And they're not, like they describe women differently, and they don't, like it doesn't seem realistic for their female characters,
Mhm.
and that's a big problem. Like I read this one, a friend of mine, she had posted, and the guy was just so it was so ridiculous. I mean, it was almost like it was just lathered in butter and syrup. It was that just ridiculous. And I feel like that on top of that, it's also an issue with people writing about people of color. It's like a lot of the writing is just about stereotypical type stuff,
Mhm.
and it's not a representative of a person. So I'll give you an example, and this is kind of like where I'm going leading into. So my first book with the Blood Thresher, The Devil's in the Metal, the main character Anna, she is Asian, and she's a female, and she's Asian. Excuse me. My second book, Anna's still in there. My third book, it is called Blood Thrasher, The Queen of New Orleans, and the main character, well, one of the main characters is going to be like a New Orleans voodoo princess, priestess slash vampire. Like she was, a slave back in the day, and she got her freedom, and now she's, like she's a vampire, right? So it's got a lot of like, Haitian type voodoo, I guess, or whatever. And there's like this whole trope of that. And so I've been doing some research about writing this character.
Mhm.
And so, what would you say to me? I'm a white guy writing about a character of a person of color.
Mhm. Oh, my first suggestion would be if you're intent on using like um this culture for this person for this character, definitely do your research. But actually, I would talk to people who actively practice hoodoo, and try to make sure that you're actually not using things that they find to be sacred um, in their culture, right? So I would definitely talk to someone who practices, or if you've not been to New Orleans, I would definitely go to New Orleans and spend time there talking to people who are in that culture. Because one of the big things is like when I usually tell people just do your research, but what I found is when people research stuff online, that there's some things online that are available to you, but aren't necessarily what you should put in print or utilize in your text. Like if I research that I'm going to publish this book on voodoo, but not earmarking the pieces that are sensitive, that are sacred, right? Or that shouldn't be like utilized as fodder for stories. And so I think it's really important if you can to talk to someone who is just as if I was going to use Catholicism, I would actually go talk to a priest because I want to make sure that I get these things right, or if I'm not supposed to convey that in this manner, then I shouldn't convey that in this manner in my text. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Just be responsible with the knowledge that you're getting. And the internet makes it weird. So if you can find someone who actually practices that, that would be your most best choice to make sure that you don't hit the wrong buttons with that.
And leading up after that, same thing with writing about other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's important, because I think you as a writer you should write your characters about what you know, and then write about things that you want to write about. But when you misrepresent something and it's just so blatantly obvious, I think that's just a big problem in writing today. Yeah,
And
especially
there's
with indie
two
writing.
issues with that. Oh yeah, there's two issues with writing the other. And DC Shaw and Cynthia Ward and Kay Tempest Bledsoe have a great series called Writing the Other that is like a whole series about the pitfalls and ways to how to write the other. If you're not in that culture or don't identify within that spectrum, here's how they have. It's a great series. So that's one if you were looking to get assistance with that, that's one that I would check out. But there's two things I tell people. One, that no group is a monolith. So just because your friend Anne does X, Y, and Z doesn't mean that every person in that demographic or who identifies as that will do those things.
Right.
Okay. And two, the second thing is be mindful that when you write, you're writing from your default, which is usually white default. And so try to avoid describing your characters of color with food products for their skin. Oh, she had cafe au lait skin. Oh, she had chocolate skin or
Yeah,
coffee skin, or okay, or she, please try to avoid that because that's not
it's
how we.
awful.
I don't get up in the morning and be like, oh, look at my nice, dark chocolate skin. I don't do that, and
Right.
so I don't. So be mindful of what POV you're writing from. If you're writing as a Black woman, know that she's not going to get up in the morning and think that her skin looks perfectly chocolate
Yeah,
or
yeah,
some
it is,
food
and that's
product,
what I was
right?
saying
So,
earlier about people writing like from a stereotype. That they, oh well, so and so and so. I think it's so ridiculous. I mean, I wouldn't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, my skin looks like a white onion." You know,
but I Adam have layers, and so it
right,
could be a parfait.
right. I
Right.
don't
So
want to wake up and look like a potato.
I think that right. So I think that's really important is to just be. I tell people all the time that if you're going to write, they're people first. So
Yeah,
just be mindful that if you have a fully well-rounded character, you will most often avoid cliches
yeah.
and stereotypes.
Yeah, and I feel like it is important to be able, because if you only wrote about you and people that looked like you and that was it, you limit yourself so much. But I think if you're going to write about, like, because look at the world that we live in today. If I were
It's
just to,
incredibly diverse, right?
yeah, if I just look at like people I work with, and I wrote a story just about folks that I work with, right? I mean,
Mhm.
just like an average day. If I wrote like a little essay about my average day, what would I, if I excluded anybody that wasn't white, I would leave out 50% of the folks that I work with. You know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, we're more global now, and we're definitely a more diverse society. But I also think that sometimes it's just easier because that's your default.
yeah,
And most of the time, if your friendship circle looks like you, it's very difficult for you to consider not. It's like there was a particular show on HBO, but I won't name it. back in the day that depicted New York as, pretty much all white women. And, if anyone's been in New York City, it is one of the most diverse cities in the
Right,
world.
right,
And so this idea, but that was that person's bubble, right? All
right.
her friends looked like her, and that was her bubble. And she just didn't even think that, hey, this is not a true
It's like, wait a
representation of
minute,
New
does this
York.
actually look like New York? No.
So it's just like we say there should be, you should have a diverse writers room. Your if you should look around at your friend group or your writer group and say, hey, are we all just mirror images of each other, right? And so that way, that's one of the ways too to kind of make sure that you're incorporating different types of people in
Mm-hmm.
your real life, so
Mm-hmm.
that your fiction life that you represent or write about is a lot more rich. So
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. One of the things, and it's kind of along the same vein, but one of the things I feel like, though, is, like you said earlier, making sure that it's not something that's sacrilegious to the culture or whatever.
hmm
And I'm just going to say this. I don't think it should be where I would write an all African American story just because that's not my life, right?
hmm hmm
And I wouldn't expect someone to be like, oh well, because I feel it's the same thing. Like, I'm a heterosexual male. I wouldn't write a story from a LGBTQIA
hmm
perspective, um, but I might write a character that is LGBTQ, or I might write a
Right.
character who's African American, you
hmm
know, but not. I wouldn't feel
Your lead,
comfortable.
your protagonist wouldn't be. That's what you're saying.
Well, no, not necessarily. I just wouldn't feel comfortable saying like, oh, this is an African American story and I'm a white guy. You know what I mean? Because
Right.
like
No,
that's not
I understand.
my background or my culture.
hmm
And it's not to say that I can't write about other folks that I know and that are part of my life.
hmm
It's just that that's not my viewpoint,
Nope,
right?
I agree.
And I
It's not
don't
your
think,
story.
yeah, I don't think, and that's one of the things that I feel like is part of the problem today too, is that we have stuff out there that, that are that trying to represent stuff and it's not the way it really is. And then
hmm
it's like, okay, well, if you going back to comic books, for example, and if you want to have your character switch over to being, whatever, that's cool. Fine. Get a writer, get an artist that represents that. Have people that's what their life is and they know that life,
Right.
represent that.
Because there are nuances to living that life.
Mhm.
So we didn't get a biracial Peter Parker in Miles Morales. What we got was a new character who was Miles Morales, and in Miles, his whole lifestyle and character arc and his interactions with his parents and everything is his. It's his own character stuff. It's not a um, we took Peter Parker and we made him this, right? We're not blackwashing Peter Parker. We just created a new character. Brian Michael Bendis said, "Hey, let's do this, other character in a different timeline, right?"
I like how they
For
tied that in
Spider-Man.
too, as an alternate universe or whatever, right?
Yes.
That makes
And so
sense.
that, yeah, and so I think that that's one thing you can do, and I think because there are nuances to being, we know Peter Parker's from Queens, right? But that's not where Miles is, and so it's a very different part of New York. It's a very different culture. His, mom's Hispanic, dad is black. It's a very different being biracial. So there's a whole lot of nuance work, character work that goes into building Miles. It's so very different from Peter Parker. And
Oh
I
yeah.
like that they just didn't say, okay, we're going to reboot Spider Man, but we're going to make sure, Peter Parker is biracial. No, they completely said, this is a new character, moving on, right?
Yeah.
Something different for new generation that's kind of representative of the America that we're having, which is one that is, becoming more and more blended. And, so it was just really great the way that Marvel handled that.
Yeah. I've got to do a station break real quick here, and then we're going to come back just a few minutes here. So, everybody, thank you for tuning in today.
107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is brought to you by listeners and the Ships of the Sea Museum. One of the hidden secrets of the Ships of the Sea Museum is its gardens. Native plants are interspersed with exotic tropical plants throughout the gardens. Visitors can enjoy everything that has earned the Ships of the Sea Museum the Trip Experts 2015 Experts Choice Award. You can find out more about the Ships of the Sea Museum at the website shipsofthesea.org.
Okay, Bass, do you mind playing a little bit for us? This is Sebastian Messer, everybody. Awesome. Thank you, Bass. All right, everybody, if you're just now tuning in, you're listening to The Adam Messer Show. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and my special guest today is Nicole Givens Kurtz. And Nicole, right before the break, we were talking about writing from different perspectives. And I'll give you a perfect example of this is how I felt. My wife is from Mexico City. She's Mexican. She came to the U.S. and is a naturalized citizen now. We've been together since 97, so 23 years. And I know a lot about her and her culture. And I know a lot about like the food and, even like, some of the, inside jokes and stuff like that. But this is one of the reasons why it's really important to me. I always explain to my friends, I'm like, even though I know a lot about that culture, that doesn't make me, Mexican, and I don't have to be Mexican to appreciate that culture and to love, my wife and her culture.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that I can't, be part of like her stuff. It just means that I'm not Mexican, and I don't have to be Mexican. It's just like I'm not African American, but I can appreciate, my friends and their culture and, things that they do, without culturally appropriating stuff, to be able to enjoy stuff from somebody else's culture and to be part of it and share my stuff, without overstepping and saying, oh, well, we did that or I made that, and I think that's the problem with the cultural appropriation is that you get people that they copy or they imitate stuff and then they're like, oh, well, we came up with that. It's like, no, man, you didn't do that. You didn't come up with that.
You took that from here.
Yeah. And then something else too that, I try to explain to folks is like, okay, when somebody says, they're against XYZ, with the system.
Yep.
They're not saying that they don't like you as a person, like white privilege, for example. They're not saying that you as a person are, haven't had disadvantages or whatever in life. They're just talking about the system from the perspective of how it's designed and how it works. And then if you are outside of that, and you're like, well, that never happened. Well, maybe if it didn't happen to you, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen to other people.
Right. And that's the big ticket, right? That's the bell, right? That's the ding, ding, ding. A lot of people assume, well, many people now are, it have like blinders on. So if it didn't happen to me, it didn't happen. Well,
right.
It could have happened and it probably does happen, but because it doesn't happen to you, everything can't happen to you. That's completely unrealistic. So the value is in listening to and believing people's stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and so we talked about own stories, right?
Yeah.
So this is my story to tell because this is me. So there's a lot of times where I, as a Black woman, will give stories and say, well, this is what I saw at a convention, or this is what I experienced online, or this is whatever the case may be. And that doesn't hold the same weight or value as, say, a white woman who may have experienced the same thing. That is white privilege. Does that mean that the white woman didn't get harassed online or didn't have negative? No. It just means that because of the way our system works in America, for some reason, because of my color or my race, I am not held to the same level of validity as the woman beside me who was white, who had the exact same experience. And so that's privilege.
It's systemic.
In that.
Yeah, it's systemic.
Right.
It doesn't.
It's completely systemic.
It's not just. It's not the person. A person. it's the system, and the system's broken.
Oh yeah, but you have to be cognizant of that to say, okay, I know I said this happened to me, and if you want to be a great ally, the white woman would say this happened to me, but it also happened to Nicole, right? And so, and having to be able to say, I'm going to use my privilege to also assist, because you guys are ignoring that Nicole also said that, and Nicole actually said it first, right?
Right.
And bringing that awareness to that conversation,
Right.
not taking over it, not commandeering it, but saying, hey, I'm gonna use my privilege because now you're paying attention to me, but I am not the first person to say this, and I'm also not the only one. It also happens to this person of color over here, and so that's being a good ally. But it's also like, I know the word privilege is a misnomer, right? It makes people think that you somehow got it quote easy or better. And you do relatively compared to people who aren't as great. And so I think that's kind of where, well, I've had to work hard my whole life. Sure, you did, but you also have it. If it was hard for you your whole life, imagine if you're not a white man.
Right. Right.
And so heterosexual white man. And so just having those conversations, no one's saying that Adam had it better than anyone else growing up. We're just saying that you had maybe perhaps a smoother ride of it than a black woman does.
And the weird
Right.
thing is with the counter argument that I've heard too is like, well, I never, this and the other, and I've tried to explain to folks, it's like, okay, they're not pointing to you and saying you are the problem. They're trying to say the system is the problem, and that if you look at the system and the different parts of the system
Right.
that add up collectively,
Mhm.
they are disadvantaging anybody who is not white, right?
Right.
And actively disadvantaging people. So, and that's not, I'm not trying to, play the race card or anything like that. I'm not trying to sound like that. I'm not trying to play the victim card or anything like that, which is part of the counter argument. What I'm trying to do is share with people. It's like, okay, wait a minute. You could be a white person and then see that there's a problem here. And like you said, being an ally or whatever, you can see that there's a problem here. And then, like for me, what I try to do is I try to use my voice and my platform
Right.
to help other people.
Yeah.
And also, just to like, okay, wait a minute here. This is crazy. Can we take a step back and look at what is actually really happening?
Yes. And I
And
mean, systems are made up of people. And so that's the other thing too. It's the awareness that's really key, to be able to say, I know white privilege exists, and I know that I benefited from it in a way that other people do not. And how can I use that to level this playing field? And there's an excellent cartoon that goes around and talks about equity.
oh
And
yeah,
where it's like, here's the fence, right? And you're on 3 boxes to my 1 box,
Yeah.
right? And so it's just giving people an extra box so that we can all see over the fence.
Yeah.
And that's really
Equal
all it
opportunity and equity are two
is.
different things.
Right, they are.
Yeah.
And so I just think people.
Well, there's this other meme too that I like. It shows like a track race, and it has 2 women on the left hand side and 2
Yes.
men on the right hand side.
Right.
And
And the women have like a shackle with it.
Yeah.
Yes.
and all these different obstacles that they have to overcome.
Obstacles.
And then there's that one video that they talk about, like everybody starts at the same starting line, and then they say, if you have had this, step forward. If you've had this, step backwards. And at the end of it, they look around and like all the white people are way ahead of anybody with people, any of the people of color in the video. And it's just all from their own admission, like, have I had this in my life or have I had this in my life,
Right.
And that's just kind of like, it was an eye opener. It's like, oh, okay, and I feel like, honestly, and this is one of the things I love that you're so open, but I feel like that one of the best ways to fight against inequality is to have conversations and actions. We have to take actions, and it's not just good enough to talk about it. It's like, okay, well, how can we actively, work towards dismantling this system and then creating one that's equitable for everyone?
Right.
So what are your
Exactly.
thoughts
So
on that?
basically, what are you going to do? And so I think there are lots of grassroots groups in different cities who are actually not talking about it. They're actually doing work and putting things into action. Like they're going into schools. They have after school programs. They go in and help people develop empathy for others. Because I think that's one of the things that is missing for us is this ability to care about other people. And so there's been a lot of, I taught school for like 18 years. And one of the things that teachers try to do, or we did in our classrooms, was to try to teach about empathy, and we did that by sharing text. Because I taught English, so we read other people's stories, and we didn't read a lot of dead white guy stories. We read different kinds of stories to try to expose students to being in different cultural situations, and like that's what reading does. It develops empathy, and science fiction in particular is renowned for developing empathy for others that don't look like you. Hence the whole alien, like the whole purpose of aliens originally were they were others. And so they would sometimes stand in for blacks. They would sometimes stand in for that other group of people that was foreign to you. They were, instead of just calling on that group, you just said they were alien, right? And so they had big heads and big eyes and came in spaceships, but they were othered. And so how can you find the humanity, or find your own humanity to connect to someone who looks so radically different from you? And so science fiction, and a friend of mine and I are actually working on lessons about how science fiction can be used to teach empathy to students in classes, because that's really huge.
Yeah, I agree. I think empathy is very important, and being able to understand from the other person's perspective, and not just hearing them, but also listening to
Oh
them.
yeah.
You
Hmm.
know, that is, I love reading about leadership and self development, and empathy. I feel is a skill that everybody can benefit from.
Yes,
Yeah, and it's
indeed.
amazing how many people actually don't use empathy. I mean, we all have empathy, but people that have different levels that they use it. Being able
Hmm.
to empathize. Like I said, I am a white guy, so I didn't grow up, in a black culture or a Mexican culture or anything like that. Being around my friends, growing up, I've had a lot of different African American friends growing up. I have a lot of African American friends now. I have a lot of Hispanic friends now. That doesn't mean, I mean, I'm, that I can't change it. I'm a white guy, but it means that I can understand their perspective. I can understand talking with them about, things, we have common ground. We have a lot of things. I mean, like if you think about like what people have in common, they have more things in common than they have that they're not in common with. When you
We're
sit
all
down,
human, right? So
yeah,
I
we
think
sit down at
that's
the table.
yeah. It's one of the things that I agree with you on that, and that it's the reason why when I teach class, we always talk about the idea of dehumanization. And so people are like, well, how can X happen to people? And I'm like, X happens to people because these other people don't see them as human. They see them as either animals or things. And so the level of dehumanization that takes place allows some people to detach a group's humanity from them. And therefore, they're able to do cruel and unusual things to them or hate them. And
Well,
so,
a perfect example of that is, the Holocaust.
yeah.
That's a perfect example of them. You can look here in the U.S. with slavery. You can look
Hmm.
at the plight of the indigenous folks.
Yep.
They had the Great Weeping. They were talking about this weekend about the largest slave sale in the U.S. here in Savannah.
Yep.
The Great Weeping Time, and so it. I think historically, that's what's happened with slavery and domination and genocide, things like that. It's because one populace has more technology or more power or more wealth or whatever, and they want something that the other population has, and they're like, okay, well, we're just going to take it from you because you're not human like us.
It
Like,
happens now too, and if you actually, that's why language is very important. If you, it's not on such a grand scale or like such a violent scale as well, unless well, I take that back because you do have some other things that are occurring in our contemporary setting that is very much about violence. But if you look at the language that is used to describe a people,
yes,
um, it is very much a dehumanizing language,
yes.
and so it's not
Hold
as
that thought for a second. Let me do a
yep,
station ID. You're
sure.
listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. Continue, please.
Oh, I was just saying that language that is utilized in social media, in the media, from various people in power. If you look at that language, it dehumanizes certain groups of people, and that is the same type of desensitizing or kind of reducing a populace or an ethnicity or a group it's just stripping away their humanity with words.
You know, a
And if you
perfect
say it
example of that.
enough,
Well, you know, a
yes.
perfect example of that, and I brought that up many, many times, is when you listen to a headline or you see a headline.
Hmm.
What, like, if I said, you know, a bank robber robbed the bank today, just as a generic headline, what would you assume? What are the assumptions from that?
So if it was a bank robber, I would assume it's a white guy. But I
Okay.
know that
If I said,
historically newspapers have.
well, no, no. If I and that's my point. If I said, you know, two African American males, or they would, you know, say whatever, robbed a bank today, you know, and that's what you see a lot in the media is they describe somebody's race if they're not white.
Oh yeah,
Um,
if it's
with
criminal for sure.
yeah,
Hmm.
with that, and
Hmm.
also with like a lot of the feel good stories, it's like, oh, first African American female did this, you know, did that or whatever. They do. There's a lot of that on the feel good side of it too. It's like, well, okay, that's cool, but um, why can't you just say, you know, this young girl did this, or this young girl did that, or this young kid did this or did that? You know, I don't understand why it always has to have like their race
As a
always
tag.
first. Yeah, I'm like, aren't they people just like us? Um, don't they feel the same way that we do? And it doesn't matter if you're white or not, but in the media, it's like, okay, this is, you know, and not this radio station. We're media just as well, and we're all media with the using social media, but it's something that I think is so ingrained in our culture that we don't think twice about, you know, describing people like that, you know, and we don't notice when we don't describe people. We're like, well, you know, so and so and so and so. You know, it's almost like you have to have somebody's race or gender or whatever taglined in there if they're not white, and I think that's part of the segregation of it. It's like,
Right. That's the whole white default that I talked about before as well. Like you rarely see that you say that we have it, but it's only for people who aren't white, right? So that's the white default. Right, so that's just it. Your fault for media is that television viewer, newspaper reader, blog reader, whatever is probably white, and so they have to call out the other ethnicity because they're believing the default reader, viewer, watcher is a white person, right? And so that's the whole white default, not being cognizant of your readership or your privilege. All right, when you're writing these types of texts,
you
which is
know,
why we argue that there should be a diverse writers' room. All right, there should be a diverse, like if you are doing a pilot, if you're doing a TV show, if you're doing a reality show, whatever the case may be, the people who are writing should be diverse
yeah,
so that you
especially if you're
don't end
writing
up
different
with
characters
crazy things
and
that happen, right?
yeah, and you know the crazy thing about it for me is like, you know, the U.S. population is still a majority of white people,
Hmm.
but there's a growing population of people, you know, and I always tell people, I'm like, you know, have you ever actually researched how many white people there are in the entire world compared to other like
Right.
cultures? You know, if you look at how many actual white people there are in the world compared to anybody else, there are more Asians than there are anybody else.
Oh yeah, there's more Chinese for sure. China already has 1 billion people.
Well,
So
not just China, but Asians, you know, in
right, I'm
general.
just saying that China, under the very broad definition
Yeah,
of Asian, because
but
India
China's
is
a great
also
example.
included Asian, right?
Yeah,
India is also considered Asian. So if you look at both China and India, that's well over almost 2 billion people
right,
alone, not
right.
counting the other countries that fall under that umbrella.
Did you ever see that map of like what the actual world looks like? Like it's like a like an actual size.
Mhm.
Did you ever see that
Uh,
new one? Like it's like kind of a new thing where it shows the actual size of like, you know, the countries in the world.
yes, I have.
Africa is huge.
Huge.
You
Yes.
know, and they've always portrayed like the U.S. as being so massive, and it is a big, you know, big country or whatever. But you know, if you look at compared, you know, to that, so a lot of those perceptions,
And remember that like Africa is a continent, and so
right?
it's tremendous. It has like a dozen, it's like hundreds, it's like 100 different countries in Africa, but the continent itself is like super
It's
huge. And
massive.
so
Yeah.
it was purposefully reduced in previous maps, right?
Well, and that's part of
Because
that
they
system that I'm
wanted
talking
to.
about. Like, you know, it's
Yes.
kind of like that perception. And, you know, honestly, I think with when people say white privilege, I think it would actually fall on better reception if people would say system, like the system, you know, like systemic issues, because when the counter argument that I've heard from people and listened to is when they say white privilege, it sounds almost like it's being racist, right? And it's like, okay, if you say white privilege and you mean system privilege for white people, and it's just another way to talk about it. I feel like that it's like, okay, this is a hot topic and it's it's like a hit me button, for folks. And it's like, if I say white privilege, they get your attention. And that's great, but I think to bring more people to the table that are on, like, okay, they don't want to hear its side. It's like, wait a minute, how can we communicate more effectively? How can we say, okay, because I hear this a lot, like, I'm not talking about white people when I say white privilege, then say what you're talking about. Talk about what you mean and say what you mean. If you mean system problem, say systems.
Right, say system. Well, I have two concerns with that. One point is, Black people can't be racist to white people. Racism about power structure as much as it is anything else.
Do you feel like that? So do you feel like you can't be racist against other cultures?
I can be prejudiced, but because racism isn't much about power, as it is in anything, I don't think, like, people are like, oh, it's reverse racism. That actually does not exist because Black people are not in power.
Well, I agree. There's no reverse racism. I just think it's just racism in general.
But see, that still falls under the same umbrella. I think that we could be prejudiced against other races. We could be prejudiced about, I don't like blondes, whatever. I do feel like prejudice is well within our scope, but I don't think the use of racism with African Americans is actually is appropriate, just because of the power play. That's me. That's Nicole's thing.
Right.
But I definitely think.
Well, you're not the only one that feels that way. I mean, there's a lot of people that feel that way.
There have been scholars who have written papers about it, how Black people can't be racist. We can only be prejudice in America. Now, if you go to Africa and that's a different, when the country is predominantly African or Ghanaian or what have you, that's a different conversation. But for here in the States with American, I think it's very difficult for African Americans to be racist. I don't think we can. We don't have enough power play to be racist. We're not in charge. So that goes back to that system, right? But we can definitely be prejudiced. We can definitely be hateful. We can definitely be mean. We can do all those things for people. But I just don't think we can be
Isn't
racist.
that the definition of racism, though?
What?
What you just said?
Hate?
Yeah, well, you don't somebody else because of their skin color?
Well, racism, that's one definition of racism, but, racism is also systemic. And so it's about power as much as it is anything else. And so I think that there are many conversations about race. I just don't think that it's, personally, I do not go out and say Black people can be racist. Because I don't believe we can. We just do not have
I understand
that capacity. I definitely think we can be prejudiced.
I honestly think everybody can be racist and prejudiced. And I think people are, like, prejudice means you prefer, like, one over the other. And to me, racist is more like you're not, well, to me, racist, from my understanding, from whatever, I mean, this, again, coming from a white perspective, is racist is when you don't like somebody else because of your color. Prejudice is when you like somebody of your color because of your color.
Wow.
So
those are really simple definitions. It's a much more complex topic.
Right.
It's really, but we don't have time to get into how.
No. I'm just saying.
Today. But no, those are my only 2 points. But I definitely think that my second point was, if people aren't ready to come to the table because the word privilege turns them off, and they're not ready to have the conversation, no matter what you label it as.
That's true. That is true. People are going to turn off because of a lot of reasons. But I guess what my point with communicating is, like, if you've got a message, right, and you're trying to get it out there more, and you're trying to reach a bigger audience, trying to get more people that want to come to the table, it's like you have to. What do they say? You always want to write for your audience, right? So
but if you want people to come to the table to discuss, like, racial issues and equity and equality, those 2 things, then you have to already be open to some really uncomfortable conversations and stuff work. And if the word privilege makes you not want to talk about it, then you're not ready to have that talk.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. It's just, how do we break through that barrier so that people that are on that side of the fence can... Well,
it's just like with an alcoholic. You have to first acknowledge that you have a problem. You first have to acknowledge that, wait a minute, I'm ready to have this difficult talk and do this difficult work.
And acknowledge there is a system,
that is already in place that benefits me more than it does others, whether you use the word privilege or not.
Right.
And so I think that when you're ready to have that talk, then you don't really care that it's called privilege because you're ready to do that work, whether you call it system or privilege or not. But if the
Right.
word is already offensive to you, you're not ready to do the work because the word is the least of it.
Right. Right.
Right?
Well, I think
The rest-
the I guess the point I was making with the white privilege thing is like it's used as a hot button to like
Oh, yeah.
attack people, and that's not the point of trying to bring. And that's why I've tried to explain to other people that like when people say white privilege, they're not attacking you, even though it might feel like you're being attacked. They're trying to say that there's a problem with the system here. There's a problem with
I
how
do
they've
agree
been
with that.
treated
They already got their
overall.
hackles up. Yeah,
Right.
where they already got. Then if you're already like getting your hackles up because someone said you're benefited from that because you have white privilege,
Right.
I do, and I think you're right. Like we can have the conversation saying, well, if you feel personally attacked by this, you need to go and maybe sit with it a while. All right, take the word and
Well,
sit with it.
and it's a responsibility on everybody's part to try to make a society that's better for everybody, equitable for
Well,
everybody.
sure.
And not just try to attack folks or try to be defensive about
No.
things. It's like, okay,
Right,
well,
no, I
how do we move forward? How do we say, okay, yeah, there is a problem here, And one of the things I like, with what you're doing with Slay, is this is an action. You're trying to be representative of your culture and other people and showing like a different perspective. And I think that's a great way to bring people to the table and say, oh, wait a minute, here's something that's different that you might not be used to seeing, in a book or something like that with these characters,
Right.
and I think that's one great way to be able to, sit down with everybody at the table and say, hey, you know what, guess what, this is not what you're used to, but you might like it.
Yes. Right. No, I agree.
Yeah.
Completely.
So, well, I appreciate you being on the show today, Nicole. Thank you so much. And I look forward. I'd love to have you back on at some point in the future where we could talk more. When is the book coming out?
Oh, it comes out in October, but if you sign up for our newsletter, you get updates on how we're doing with the process.
Okay. And what's the best place where people can check your stuff out?
MochaMemoirsPress.com.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
All right, everybody. Stay tuned. We're going to come up at 4:00 with Bobby Nash.
This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. This is